a lie whispered through firelight, a judge found still in his chair, and a signature that never should have existed. This is a mystery stitched with false names, buried guilt, and a past that refuses to stay silent. In this case, truth does not heal. It haunts. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a cheerless morning in late January that I found myself once again in our old rooms at Baker Street, the fire crackling in its grate while the outside world lay muffled beneath a sooty London fog. Holmes sat with a curious rigidity in his chair, not lounging, as was his habit, but upright, his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed upon the flickering hearth. There was a peculiar stillness about him, a statue carved from lean angles and iron will, unmoved by the wind rattling against the windows. I knew better than to interrupt such moods. They were rarely idle. Beneath that impassive mask, his faculties were most active when least expressive. And so, I turned to my own cup of tea, the silence between us stretching not with awkwardness, but with the quiet suspense of a mind about to reveal its latest marvel. The knock, when it came, was brisk and official. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Hamley of Scotland Yard, a man of precise moustache and uncertain confidence. I had encountered him but twice before. He was earnest, if occasionally overwhelmed in Holmes's presence. "Mr. Holmes," he began, hat still in hand, "I come not with a crime, but with a question, though I suspect the two may yet become one." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his fingers never leaving their perch. "Proceed, Inspector." Hamley drew a folded sheet from his coat. This prescription was presented at a chemist's in Sevenoaks. It bears the signature of one doctor, Adrian Melrose, whose practice lies in Kent. But the pharmacist flagged it. The patient listed had been deceased for over a year. He handed Holmes the paper. "There have been others. Small errors, oddities, inconsistencies, but all quiet, all legal, on the surface." Holmes accepted the page with the same reverence one might offer a coded message from the front lines. Holmes studied the paper but a moment before passing it to me. "The ink is recent. See how it bleeds faintly along the grain. Not written with a practiced hand either. Note the hesitation in the loop of the M and the choice of pen. Steel-nibbed, not gold, inconsistent with Melrose's known habits." I examined the document, but the distinctions eluded me. "And yet," Holmes continued, rising at last, "the true anomaly lies not in how it was forged, but in how it fails." Hamley looked up. "Fails, Mr. Holmes." "Indeed. The error in the patient's date of death, the incorrect dosage, the inverted chemical shorthand for tincture of opium, all unmistakable to any trained eye. No skilled forger would risk such mistakes unless—" He trailed off, eyes narrowing. "Unless they wished the forgery to be discovered," I finished. Holmes nodded faintly. "Precisely. The deception is theatrical. Someone has crafted not a convincing falsehood, but a conspicuous one, and that, Inspector, transforms your quiet question into something far more pressing." Hamley blinked. "You believe this was intentional?" "I believe," said Holmes, "we are being summoned." The phrase left Holmes's lips as though it were both diagnosis and poetry. "A lie with a limp," he repeated softly, pacing now. "A calculated defect, hobbling just enough to draw the eye, but never to collapse entirely." I watched as he passed the hearth. The fire reflected in his eyes with a gleam I had come to recognize over the years, a glint reserved only for the rarest of puzzles. "The author of this forgery," he murmured, "wanted it noticed, not by the chemist, not by Scotland Yard, but by me. I confess I shivered then, not from the cold, but from the strange intimacy of the thing. A message disguised as error, a summons issued through the flaw in a lie, and Holmes had heard it as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. After Hamley's departure, Holmes resumed his seat by the fire, the forged prescription now resting upon the mantel like a half-burned letter. He made no motion for his pipe, no summons for the violin. He merely sat, staring at the curling edges of the paper as the flames licked the grate. I waited, unwilling to intrude upon the spell that had settled over him. At last, he whispered, not to me, it seemed, but to the shadowed room itself. Why announce a lie, unless one wishes to be caught? He spoke the question not with triumph, but with something more akin to wonder, as if the puzzle had reached across the fog from some distant hand, and Holmes had only just recognized the signature in the fold. The game, it seemed, had already begun. It was scarcely an hour after Inspector Hamley's departure that we were again disturbed, this time by the soft yet purposeful footfall of a woman ascending our staircase. Mrs. Hudson, with a glance I have long known to accompany the arrival of those whose nerves were already tested before reaching our door, announced the visitor in a hushed tone. The lady who entered was of the middle height, dressed with sober elegance, her face partially veiled, and her gloved hands tightly clasped before her. Yet it was not her appearance that struck me, it was the quiet disarray in her composure. A tremor in her right hand belied the control she sought to maintain, and though her voice, when she spoke, was calm, it bore the tension of a bowstring drawn too tight. "I am Clara Ferro," she said, "and I have come on behalf of someone who, I fear, is either gravely endangered or deeply unwell." Holmes gestured for her to be seated, his gaze already fixed upon her with that expression I had come to recognize, a kind of quiet, surgical interest that stripped pretense without the need for a word. She sat, composed herself, and began to speak. Whatever tale she had brought, Holmes had already deduced that it was not one easily borne. "My fiancé," she began, "is Dr. Adrian Melrose, a physician of high standing in Edinburgh. He is, or was, a man of diligence and distinction, beloved by his patients, esteemed by his colleagues. We were to be married in the spring." She paused, her hands briefly twisting in her lap before she resumed. "But over the past month, I have observed changes, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He has become withdrawn, forgetful in his habits. At times, I have found him staring into nothingness, and on more than one occasion he has spoken aloud when alone, as though addressing someone not present." Holmes neither nodded nor interrupted. He watched her steadily, allowing the silence to draw her deeper into the matter. I attempted to dismiss it as exhaustion or the strain of work, but then I found certain prescriptions in his desk, unusual ones, issued to patients I had never heard him mention. When I confronted him, he became evasive, even frightened. Her voice faltered slightly. "I do not know whether he is being blackmailed, or if he is unwell in mind, but something has taken hold of him, and whatever it is eroding the man I knew, bit by bit." From the reticule she carried, Miss Ferro now withdrew a folded paper, its edges scorched, its contents partially obliterated by what appeared to be both time and haste. "I found this," she said, "in the lining of his greatcoat. It was half burned, tucked into a seam, as though someone had intended to destroy it but was interrupted. I cannot read all of it, but the parts that remain—" She placed the paper on the table between us. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers unfolding it with great care. I followed suit, and together we examined the fragmented contents. What could be read was cryptic at best. "You cannot hide behind that name forever. R is not blind, and R does not forgive. The ledger must be returned before another dies." The signature was absent. So too was any date or clear reference, but in the upper margin a faint scrawl remained. 2 a.m. Holmes tapped the name with his index finger. So the doctor has a secret correspondent, and one not lacking in menace. Miss Ferro looked between us, her expression now tight with dread. I fear, she said quietly, that whoever this R is, they are not finished with him. Holmes said nothing, but I saw the fire rekindling behind his grey eyes. Holmes rose and walked to the window, the missive still in hand. He stood there a long moment before speaking. Dr. Adrian Melrose, he began slowly, a man of virtue, now accused by silence, shadowed by an unknown R, and issuing prescriptions to the dead. He turned, his gaze fixed upon Miss Ferro. You are not mistaken in your instincts, Miss Ferro. The man you describe is either under threat, or is himself a threat concealed. She stiffened slightly, but Holmes's voice remained even, not accusatory. I have seen it before, a good man pressed into duplicity, or a false man cloaked in borrowed honour. In either case, we must examine what is missing, not merely what is present. He returned to the fireplace, where the flickering coals had begun to settle into embers. With a flick of his wrist, he laid the letter beside the forged prescription left by Inspector Hamley. 2 clues, he said softly. One lies outward, the other inward. The prescription is a flag waved too boldly. The letter is a whisper slipped through the seams. Then, turning to me with that faint, familiar glint, he murmured, Come, Watson. Let us visit a doctor who may not be who he claims to be. And with that, the case began in earnest. It was under the guise of medical men, Holmes as a contributor to the Lancet, and I as his appointed assistant, that we arrived in Edinburgh 2 days following Miss Ferro's visit. Holmes had always maintained a curious respect for deception when it served the purpose of revelation, and on this occasion, he bore his borrowed credentials with a composure that would have impressed any scholar of anatomy. As our cab rattled through the winding streets of the old city, Holmes gazed with steady concentration at the facades of buildings and the patterns of foot traffic, noting subtle hierarchies invisible to the untrained eye. The city breathes differently when secrets dwell in its bones, he murmured, mostly to himself. It will not be long before we feel the heartbeat of it. We secured modest lodgings near the university and wasted little time in establishing contact with the clinic at which Dr. Melrose was said to practice. Holmes sent a courteous letter in Latin, invoking the reputation of a fictitious journal, and was promptly granted an invitation to observe the clinic's methodology. I could not help but remark upon his ease in assuming the character of an academic, though he would, later that evening, confess that it was a most natural performance for a man whose profession required daily scrutiny of human pretense. And so, it was with borrowed names and borrowed motives that we stepped toward the man who, if Holmes was correct, had borrowed something far more grave than identity. The following morning, we presented ourselves at the grey stone clinic that bore the modest plaque, Melrose and Partners, private consultation. The receptionist, a harried young woman of an anxious disposition, led us into a pale, airy hall where the bustle of junior doctors moved like clockwork, though not without friction. Dr. Adrian Melrose greeted us personally. He was a man of fine bearing, mid-40s perhaps, with thinning blonde hair and a deliberate manner of speech that suggested both intelligence and exhaustion. I found his manner courteous, though guarded. Holmes, however, took in the man's every movement with that quiet acuity which no polish could obscure. Melrose led us through the surgery and adjoining dispensary, offering explanations of equipment and cases. Yet as we passed through his domain, Holmes's eye lingered not upon the instruments, but upon the faces of the younger staff. The fleeting glance exchanged between 2 nurses, the subtle stiffening of a clerk's shoulders when Melrose approached. "You run a tight operation, Doctor," Holmes remarked mildly. "We must," said Melrose with a thin smile. "Illness, like mischief, thrives in disorder." But even as he spoke, Holmes paused beside a filing cabinet, his gaze drifting to a patient chart left partially exposed. "Curious," he said. "A record of Mr. P, discharged. And yet he was certified deceased last November. Most diligent for a ghost." Melrose's expression did not falter, but I noticed his hand retreat swiftly to the document, tucking it out of sight. The mask, I thought, was flawless, but behind it, something was straining. Later that day, under the pretext of wishing to conduct a more intimate interview, Holmes arranged a private visit to Dr. Melrose's residence, a tall, ivy-covered house just beyond the clinic walls. The interior was tastefully appointed, though without the warmth of habitation. Holmes wandered from room to room as Melrose fetched us tea, eventually settling in what appeared to be the man's study. I followed, instinctively sensing that Holmes had already divined its importance. The fireplace had recently been used, though no fire burned there now. Holmes crouched beside the hearth, lifting a half-burned scrap with the tip of his cane. On it, faint traces of ink remained, too charred to decipher save for two initials, singed into the corner like a final breath. R.B. "Curious what one chooses to destroy," he said softly. On the shelves nearby stood volumes of medical reference, journals, and a few worn novels. Holmes scanned them with indifferent speed, until he paused, removing a slim green book. He opened it at random and smiled faintly. Between the pages, carefully flattened, lay a crayon drawing, a child's hand, clumsy yet expressive, a house, a man, a woman, and a dark scribble with a face beneath it. He showed it to me but said nothing. Melrose returned bearing a tray, his expression unreadable. "Forgive the mess," he offered. "I had some old correspondence to dispose of." "Of course," Holmes replied, folding the drawing and returning it to the book. "We all have pages we prefer to turn." But the page, it seemed, had burned in protest. The next morning, under the pale light of a reluctant sun, Holmes led me to the University Archives, a modest, stone-arched building tucked behind the medical school. There, after polite entreaty and the display of a forged letter of recommendation, we were granted access to the academic records of Dr. Adrian Melrose. The files were thorough, as one would expect of such an institution. Melrose's early education was impeccable, prizes in pharmacology, commendations in anatomy, yet Holmes's brow furrowed as he examined the sequence of dates. "Note here," he said, tapping the margin, "a sudden transfer from the Glasgow Royal Infirmary to a provincial hospital in Dorset, unexplained and without formal commendation." I leaned in. "Perhaps a family matter." "Or a professional disgrace," Holmes replied. "Either would serve as reason for relocation. But look again." He flipped the page, revealing a gap, a 6-month period unaccounted for. No papers submitted, no clinical rotations, no record of examinations. A silence loud enough to be intentional. We left the archives without further remark. Holmes was deep in thought, but I could sense the quiet sharpening of his focus. Whatever shadow clung to Melrose's history had been carefully folded, but not erased. Holmes, as ever, was unfolding it line by line. That afternoon, by arrangement with a sympathetic junior doctor, Holmes was granted access to one of the clinic's older patient ledgers, an archival volume that predated Melrose's more recent tenure. The book was thick, its leather spine worn from use, its pages scribed in various hands. Holmes turned them carefully, scanning names, dates, and notations with practiced rhythm, until his fingers paused. He turned back a page, then forward, then back again. "This ledger," he said quietly, "moves from August to December with curious haste." I leaned in and saw what he meant. 3 months, September, October, November, were absent from the sequence. The page numbers had been adjusted, and the handwriting mimicked, but the paper itself bore subtle differences. The scent of new ink betrayed the forgery. Holmes glanced up at the door before lifting the book and examining the binding. Pages removed, Watson, neatly, precisely, and in their place, ghost entries, fabricated to cover absence. But why? I asked. Holmes shut the book with deliberate care. Because the story of this doctor cannot withstand a full telling. Someone has rewritten his past and left the spaces between to whisper the truth. I saw now that the case was no longer merely one of moral decay, but of methodical concealment. And whatever had occurred in those vanished months had cast a long shadow over the present. Late that evening, Holmes led me by cab to the outskirts of Edinburgh, where the road narrowed to a path and the buildings gave way to walled silence. We stopped before a discreet, heavily gated institution, a private asylum for the delicately afflicted. Presenting yet another letter of false authority, Holmes secured a brief conversation with the head orderly, a dour man whose uniform bespoke discretion. "We believe one of your staff may have corresponded with our colleague," Holmes lied smoothly. "A matter of medical confidentiality." The orderly, after some hesitation, confirmed that a man using the name Mr. Redford had made discreet visits over the past year, always to the same patient, always insisting the meetings remain unrecorded. "The patient's name?" Holmes asked. The orderly hesitated. "Reuben Blythe," he said at last. "A former doctor, I believe. Comes from scandal. Keeps mostly to himself." Holmes nodded once. We departed into the rising mist, the asylum shrinking behind us like the lid of a forgotten box. Holmes spoke only once more before we retired that night. "Reuben Blythe," he murmured. The initials on the burned page, the ledger's missing name, the voice behind the forgery, and then silence. With the name of a fictitious division of the Home Office and a forged seal crafted the night before, Holmes transformed himself into a figure of quiet dominion. There was nothing theatrical in his manner. His authority was expressed not in bluster, but in the precision of his speech and the unerring gravity with which he carried his forged credentials. We arrived at the Eastmoor Private Hospital under the pretense of conducting an unannounced governmental audit of institutional sanitation. A pretext just obscure enough to avoid suspicion, yet official-sounding enough to provoke no resistance. The asylum itself was a sombre place. Built of pale stone and swathed in mist, its windows narrow and its gates thick with ivy and rust. Holmes introduced himself in clipped professional tones and was met with the sort of wary compliance that such officials often inspire. The head administrator, a Mr. Denley, tall and pale as his own walls, led us into a cramped records room. "We are careful with our documentation," he assured us. "Most of our patients are private cases, often placed here discreetly." "Discretion," Holmes replied, without lifting his eyes from the ledgers, "is the currency of ruin." Mr. Denley stiffened slightly, but said nothing. Holmes leafed through the registers until he found the name we had come to confirm. Reuben Blythe. "Room 17, East Wing," Denley murmured. "He's not a danger, but he is inconsistent." Holmes closed the ledger with an audible snap. "It is the inconsistent minds that leave the deepest impressions." And with that, he turned toward the patient wing, the scent of damp stone and buried secrets following behind us. The East Wing bore a different air, quieter, cloistered, and somehow more permanent in its melancholy. We were led by a silent orderly, and as we passed each locked door, I could not help but imagine the minds that lay behind them, shadows of what once had been. Room 17 was unremarkable in appearance, but what it contained gave pause. The man who looked up from the narrow cot was perhaps in his early 60s, though illness or despair had hollowed him well beyond his years. His once black hair had thinned to wisps of grey, and his frame, though tall, had the drawn look of a man long untethered from appetite or ambition. He did not rise as we entered, but his eyes, sharp, restless, yellowed at the edges, tracked every movement. "Government man," he said. "You've come to audit the sanity, I suppose." Holmes did not reply. He allowed Mr. Denley to offer a brief introduction before requesting access to Reuben Blythe's file. It was a dense collection of notes, letters, and clipped reports. From them emerged a fractured portrait, a once revered surgeon dismissed from practice for ethical misconduct, the nature of which was suspiciously vague. There were references to anonymous threats, an investigation that had been abruptly closed, and 3 patients who had perished under experimental protocols. Most striking were the annotations in Blythe's own hand. Some pages bore formulae, others were half poems, half confessions, many of them signed not as Reuben, but with a stylized R. Holmes read without expression, but I saw the name repeated, Melrose, 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 in the margins, like an echo that refused to fade. It was Holmes who uncovered the sketch, folded between the pages of a medical journal and pressed so tightly that it resisted removal. When at last he lifted it free, I saw at once that it was a likeness, clearly drawn in haste but executed with a disturbing clarity. The woman was unmistakably Miss Clara Ferro. Her features, though penciled roughly, bore the unmistakable shape of the woman who had visited us in Baker Street. And yet the hand that rendered her had not done so with affection. Her mouth was distorted in a cruel smirk, her eyes darkened beyond recognition. Beneath the sketch, scrawled in a spidery, uneven hand, was a single word: liar. Holmes held it between 2 fingers and examined both sides. "A recent drawing," he observed. "Graphite still smudges. The paper matches that used in the dispensary records, likely stolen." I felt a chill trace my spine. So she knew him, visited him. "Or he watched her," Holmes replied, folding the paper with utmost care. "Either way, she is no stranger to this place." There was something deeply unsettling in the way the features had been altered, not merely to mock, but to accuse. "A daughter's face drawn in rage," Holmes murmured. I turned to him. "You think she is his—" "I think," he said coldly, "that we have stumbled upon a stage long set, and we are only just now hearing the final act begin." Holmes requested further information from the head orderly, this time under the pretense of verifying external medical contacts. The man, whose name I had not caught, lowered his voice and leaned close as if confession were a currency exchanged only in hushed tones. "There was a gentleman," he said. "Came under false name, signed the book as Mr. Redford. Said he was an old friend but never removed his gloves, never lifted his veil. Came at odd hours. Asked questions, but answered none." Holmes's voice was low but urgent. "How many times did he visit?" 7. Always to see Mr. Blythe. Last time was just 2 weeks past." And Mr. Blythe's reaction? He was calmer afterward, but the next day he stopped speaking entirely, didn't eat, just stared out the window. Holmes paused. "Did Mr. Redford ever leave anything behind?" The man nodded. "Once. A white envelope, unmarked, slid under the door. Blythe burned it immediately." Holmes thanked him and turned away. I followed, feeling the weight of the place press upon me. We were moving through a tapestry of false names and twisted allegiances, where fathers hid behind shadows and daughters wore masks of decorum. The corridor dimmed behind us, as though the light itself preferred not to linger. As we prepared to leave, Holmes motioned for silence. From beyond the door to room 17, we heard the low murmur of Reuben Blythe's voice, not in conversation, but in a rhythm of broken incantation. He took my name, but not my guilt. He wears the skin, but not the stain. R is watching. The words repeated, meandering through some unseen warren of his mind. Holmes did not speak, but I noticed his lips tighten, the jaw set at an angle I recognized from only the most delicate cases, where logic and pity warred beneath his calm exterior. He turned from the door without comment. Only later, as we walked beneath the looming stone and gaslight, did he utter a single phrase, spoken not to me, but to the mist itself. There is no greater madness than a borrowed past. And in that moment, I felt the cold reach further in, not from the night, but from the truth that waited, patient and exacting, to be named. Our return to London was not marked by relief, but by a curious, almost spectral apprehension that seemed to descend upon Holmes the moment our train crossed into the smoke-wreathed sprawl of the city, the grey streets, the gaslight flickering behind soot-smeared panes, even the rattle of the cab horses, all appeared to deepen his silence, as though the city itself exhaled a breath of buried consequences. He did not speak during the journey home, but once seated in his armchair at Baker Street, he finally turned to me with a grave intensity. "Watson," he said, "we are now in the shadow of what has already begun. You believe the danger is imminent." "I believe," he replied, "that the first crime has already been committed in the mind of its perpetrator. And now, like dominoes placed in a pattern no longer visible to its maker, the consequences are falling in turn." I pressed him for clarity, but he only reached for his violin, producing not music, but a slow, scraping note that grated with unease. "Watch for movement in silence, Watson. This will not unfold with violence, but with guilt, and guilt moves quietly." That night, I barely slept, kept wakeful not by fear, but by a disquieting sense of unseen design. Holmes paced until dawn, pausing often to examine the forged prescription or glance toward the sealed envelope he had retrieved from Edinburgh. When the knock finally came at daybreak, it carried not surprise, but confirmation. Inspector Lestrade himself stood upon the threshold, hat in hand, the usual skepticism in his eyes subdued by something darker. "It's Melrose," he said curtly, "found in his Bloomsbury flat, drugged, still breathing but only just." Within the hour, we were at the residence. The flat was neat, too neat, as if tidied in a panic or scrubbed clean of what should have been left behind. Melrose lay on the settee, his limbs slack, skin pale and damp with a sickly sheen. A faint trace of chemical sharpness lingered in the room. Holmes examined the scene with precision. The window had been jimmied, but nothing of value was missing. A teacup rested near the hearth, still half full. Holmes sniffed it once, then turned to the inspector. "Opium laced with chloral," he said. "Measured to incapacitate, not to kill. The dosage betrays caution." "Could be a burglary gone wrong," Lestrade offered. Holmes raised a brow. "Burglars do not leave their victims alive and lock the door behind them." Melrose stirred faintly but did not wake. Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved a single sheet of paper from the waste bin, torn but legible. "Dear R, I cannot—" The rest was smeared. "This was a visit," Holmes said quietly. "Not an attack. And the guest brought more than sedatives." "Then what was the purpose?" I asked. "To silence a conscience," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps to awaken it." The second blow arrived scarcely 24 hours later. A wire from Eastmoor Hospital informed us, in tones of muted panic, that one of their patients had vanished. "Reuben Blythe is gone," Holmes said aloud, handing me the telegram. "Slipped through the bars like fog through a fence." "Impossible," I said. "Surely a man in his condition—" "He was never mad," Holmes interrupted. "Only buried, and now the grave has unlatched." The message included a curious postscript from Mr. Denley. A torn fragment of the visitor registry had been left on Blythe's cot, ripped precisely through the name column, preserving only the date and time. Beneath it, the orderly had found a small drawing, sketched on the back of an envelope in smudged graphite. It depicted a gavel, exaggerated, grotesque, slamming downward upon an indistinct figure. Above it, in shaky block letters, "Judgment returns." Holmes studied it with narrowed eyes. He has unfinished business. Revenge? Possibly. Or revelation. The next morning I awoke to find Holmes gone. He returned before noon, his coat damp with sleet. "There is an obituary," he said quietly, "that has not yet been printed." When I asked what he meant, he merely replied, "We must prepare for a death that was signed in ink long before it is delivered in fact." 2 days later, the obituary Holmes had foreseen made its appearance, not in the form of inked words, but as a whispered report from Lestrade. "Name Sir Rowland Ferrers," the inspector said, "retired magistrate, found dead in his chair, no signs of violence. Coroners called it heart failure." We accompanied him to the residence, a sombre oak-lined study in Mayfair, its stillness pierced only by the faint tick of a neglected clock. The judge sat slumped in his chair, spectacles tilted, his mouth open in a frozen half-word. On the desk before him lay a sealed envelope, addressed to no one. Holmes opened it delicately. Inside was a single sheet. "Justice delayed is justice denied. You gave me ruin when I brought you truth. Let this verdict reach the grave you escaped." It was unsigned, but the script bore the same hand as the envelope, drawing from Eastmoor. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Heart failure, yes, but assisted. He ingested laudanum an hour before his death. With it, a paralytic designed to mimic cardiac arrest." Lestrade scoffed. "That's not murder, that's suicide." Holmes's voice grew cold. "Number it is murder by confession. The weapon was not poison, but guilt, forced upon him by the spectre he thought buried." He stood over the corpse. This man condemned Reuben Blythe, perhaps rightly, but he did not silence him. I felt then the peculiar chill of justice exhumed. For in that silent study, death had worn a robe and carried not a sword, but a mirror. We returned to Baker Street that evening, weary but unresolved. Yet even as Holmes removed his coat, a new knock resounded at the door, this time a constable, hat in hand and face drawn with unease. "Miss Clara Ferro," he reported. "Gone, sir. Her landlady says she vanished yesterday without warning. Left everything behind, clothes, correspondence, even her hat and gloves." "She left no note?" "None. Window was open, lock untouched." Holmes accepted the news with peculiar calm, almost as if it had been expected. He lit his pipe and stared into the fire. "Do you believe she was taken?" I asked. "I believe," he replied slowly, "that the hourglass has been turned by a second hand. We now deal not with secrecy, but with desperation." I said nothing. In Holmes's expression I saw not confusion, but calculation. He was placing figures upon a board none of us could yet see clearly. "Wherever she has gone," he murmured, "she is not fleeing. She is moving towards something." And I feared then that whatever lay at the end of that path, it bore the shape of sacrifice. It was late that night when Holmes called me into his study. Laid out before him were 2 documents, the prescription note from London and a page from Reuben Blythe's asylum file. "Note the flourishes in the R," Holmes said, "and the loop in the B. Identical. This," he tapped the prescription, "was not written by Adrian Melrose." He reached into his drawer and produced a death certificate, dated 13 years prior. "Dr. Adrian Melrose died of typhoid in Aberdeen. Quiet case. Buried without family. Reuben Blythe took his name, his credentials, and his profession." "And Clara?" I whispered. Holmes's eyes narrowed. She knew, but not all of it. I stared at the signature. One name, two men. And the truth, written in the shape of guilt. For 3 nights, Holmes scarcely spoke. He moved through our sitting room with the air of a man who had completed a long equation and was now merely waiting for its proof to unfold in the world. On the 4th evening, as the lamplight trembled across the curls of his violin case, he spoke at last. "She is not Clara Ferro," he said quietly, not turning from the fire. "You refer to... She is Rebecca Blythe, daughter of Reuben, her true name buried as surely as her father's scandal." I stared at him in astonishment. "But the engagement, her affection for Melrose..." "Fabricated," he replied. "A ruse to draw close to the man who had stolen not only her father's name, but, she believed, his honour. The engagement was the bait, Watson. Not for Melrose, but for the truth." I felt a strange unease settle within me. And the murder? She came seeking answers. But the dead do not speak, and Reuben, buried in another's skin, refused to confess. And so she turned the tools of his trade, medicine, secrecy, guilt, back upon those she held responsible. "Then she is not innocent," I murmured. Holmes turned then, his eyes alight with cold certainty. "Number, but nor is she wicked. She is the echo of a ruined legacy, trained in silence, weaponized by truth, and undone by grief." He tapped his fingers against the mantel once. "The time has come to draw back the veil." And the plan, which he had kept locked behind his eyes until that very moment, began to take form. The chambers of Montague and Harwood's solicitors, tucked along a narrow corridor near the Strand, were known for their discretion. Holmes arranged a summons to Miss Ferro under the pretense of an official inquest concerning the death of Sir Rowland Ferrers and its medico-legal implications. She arrived punctually, dressed in greys too dark for the hour, her gloves immaculate, her eyes still. I observed her as one might observe a glass about to crack under heat. Yet no visible fissure showed. Holmes greeted her with measured courtesy. "Miss Ferro, thank you for coming. The Crown, as you know, is obliged to investigate unnatural deaths when medical records or associations raise questions." "I understand," she replied. We sat her before a long oak table. She folded her hands and waited. Holmes, meanwhile, stepped to the adjoining chamber, opened the door, and gave the faintest nod. From within, assisted by a silent attendant, came Reuben Blythe, gaunt, spectral, but standing. He remained hidden behind a half curtain, unseen to her. Holmes began, not with accusation, but with history. "You were born in Oxford. Your father, once a fellow of surgery. He was struck from the register in 73. You were 10. She flinched, just once. "You assumed the name Ferro in 81. You attended nursing lectures in Edinburgh. You tracked down the man calling himself Melrose, and then you entered his life." She said nothing. "You are not here as a witness," Holmes concluded. "You are here as the fulcrum upon which this tragedy turned." At last, she spoke. "Then you already know what I came to learn." It was not defiance. It was mourning in the shape of confession. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded page, yellowed at the edge, still bearing the faint scent of camphor and damp linen. "This," he said, "was retrieved from the seam of Reuben Blythe's asylum mattress, where he had stitched it with surgical precision. It was never meant to be found, but it was written to be read." He unfolded it slowly, and I saw Rebecca's eyes fix upon it, as if drawn by a force beyond reason. Holmes read aloud. "To R.B., the second. You came to me not in fury, but in silence. You asked why I left your name behind, why I chose another's path, another's face. You must understand, I was not escaping justice, but shame. The law had no patience for context. My methods were crude, yes, but born of desperation. When I saw Melrose die, alone and nameless, I envied him. He had no past to haunt him. I took his name not to deceive the world, but to forget myself. But you are the voice I buried. You were meant to be spared. If you are reading this, then I have failed. I ask no forgiveness, only that you leave the next verdict unwritten. Holmes folded the letter and returned it to the desk. Rebecca sat rigid, eyes unfocused, the breath caught between fury and collapse. "You knew?" she whispered. Holmes's reply was merciless in its clarity. "He knew the moment you entered his life, but neither of you spoke. That was the first crime." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Rebecca remained still for a moment longer, then rose abruptly. "I did not kill the judge," she said. "I offered him a choice." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A choice?" "I placed the compound in the bottle beside his laudanum, marked identically. If he drank, it was his own hand." "A physician's logic," Holmes murmured. "Learned from a father who once experimented on patients in secret wards." Reuben stepped forward now, brushing aside the curtain. The effect was immediate. Rebecca's face paled and her mouth trembled. "You should not be here," she whispered. He reached for her hand, but she pulled back. "I never meant for this," he said, voice frail. "The sins were mine, not yours." "You made me your silence," she replied, barely audible. Holmes looked from one to the other, then said coldly, "Guilt is not transferable. It is not a burden to be gifted. It roots itself where it is fed." He stepped between them. "Do you believe justice was served?" he asked her. She did not answer. "Do you believe your father loved you?" Still silence. Then Holmes, with that unflinching sharpness which I had seen break men more formidable than either, said, "Guilt writes its own letters, Miss Blythe, sometimes with blood." At that, she sank into the chair, head bowed, and Reuben, once the thief of names and years, stood like a man finally without mask or shield, and wept. She did not resist the silence. It settled about the chamber like a shroud, yet she neither shifted nor turned away. Rebecca Blythe, daughter of the disgraced and self-exiled physician, sat with her eyes lowered, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles blanched to marble. "It was not poison," she said at last, her voice thin but deliberate. "It was a paralytic compound my father once described to me. Before Eastmoor, before all of it." Holmes remained motionless. I, however, felt the hairs along my arms rise. "He used it sparingly," he said. "A derivative of Indian arrowroot, fast, clean, undetectable within hours. It mimics natural cardiac arrest. In high doses, it suffocates the body without bruising the lungs." She glanced upward then, not at Holmes, but at me. "I gave the judge a tincture of it, placed beside his laudanum bottle, with a matching label. I knew he would choose it himself, just as he once chose to condemn a man without trial." I could not speak. The clarity of her rationale, bound with a sense of justice so coldly executed, struck me with unease more profound than any ordinary crime. Holmes's face remained unreadable. "You knew what it would do," he said quietly. "I hoped it would do what the courts did not," she replied, "and perhaps grant my father some measure of peace." Holmes nodded once, slowly, as though confirming a theory long held. "But peace," he said, "is rarely the fruit of vengeance. More often, it is its final victim." Rebecca's eyes clouded, and for a moment her composure wavered. Her voice, when it returned, carried a tremor it had previously withheld. "He never asked me to do it," she said. "He never once said the judge should die. But there were stories." Her gaze turned inward, distant. He would speak of Ferrers as if from a wound, not a memory, of how the man twisted his trial, humiliated him before peers, erased years of dedication because of one desperate experiment. She clasped her arms. I was young when the scandal broke. We lived in shadows. I heard whispers through walls, saw him weep into his sleeves, and when he vanished into that name, Melrose, I understood it as survival, not deceit. She turned to Holmes now. But when I found him, broken and mute, locked behind that name, it seemed that justice had only changed shape, and I wanted to repay it in kind. Holmes said nothing. I sensed he was weighing something heavier than guilt or innocence. I studied under other names, she went on. Learned medicine, chemistry, toxins. I told myself it was for healing, but every lesson whispered his legacy. Every compound recalled his silence. Her voice faltered again. When the judge's obituary appeared in the Times, he smiled, Mr. Holmes. For the first time in years, he smiled. She covered her face. But then he knew, and I saw in his eyes not gratitude, but despair. The silence stretched until Holmes at last spoke. Your father's sins were buried under false names. You unearthed them, not to condemn him, but to justify yourself. And with that, the room turned colder still. The knock at the door did not startle her. Perhaps she had expected it all along. Inspector Lestrade entered with characteristic economy, hat under one arm, eyes fixed with official detachment. Holmes made no introduction. He merely stepped aside, gesturing lightly toward Rebecca. She stood slowly with the dignity of a mourner rather than a prisoner. As Lestrade approached, cuffs still tucked into his coat, Holmes looked directly at her. He said no word, no rebuke, no comfort, and that, more than any utterance, seemed to pierce her. She met his gaze once, as though searching for a judgment, perhaps even forgiveness, but found instead only the impassable veil of Holmes's resolve. Lestrade placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. This way, miss. She walked without resistance. As she passed Reuben, who had remained motionless in the corner, their eyes met briefly, but no words were exchanged. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed louder than any slam. Holmes remained by the window, arms folded, his silhouette a study in restraint. And I, though trained to write what I see, could find no word fit for the silence that followed. Long minutes passed before Reuben Blythe moved. When he did, it was not with the defiance of a ruined man, nor the collapse of the condemned, but with the quiet disintegration of something long held together by will alone. He sank into the nearest chair, his form hunched, hands trembling, face averted. No sound escaped him, save for the breath that hitched and faltered like a child learning to weep again. Holmes approached only after some time. He placed a single sheet of paper, a transcript of the letter hidden in Reuben's mattress, upon the table. You buried the truth to protect her, he said, but lies rot in silence, and when they break free, they leave nothing unbroken. Reuben gave no reply. Perhaps there was none to give. As I turned to leave with Holmes, he paused at the threshold. Then, with the quiet force of a gavel falling in a chamber none could leave unchanged, he uttered, "The past is never buried. It simply learns to write prescriptions under a different name." And with that, he departed. I followed, the echo of those words trailing behind us like a physician's shadow down a long, cold corridor. The return journey to London was veiled in silence. Outside the train carriage, a grey mist clung to the countryside, softening the edges of each passing field, as if the very world had taken a vow of discretion after the violence of truth. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfixed, though I knew full well that the engine of his mind had not ceased its quiet revolutions. He had spoken scarcely a dozen words since the handing over. The case, in its legal sense, was complete. But I sensed that to Holmes, the greater reckoning had only just begun. More than once, I considered addressing him, to ask what troubled him most, the deception, the misplaced vengeance, or the tragic integrity of a daughter bound too tightly to her father's shadow. But something in his expression dissuaded me. It was not melancholy nor fatigue. It was the measured stillness of a man who had seen not justice or crime, but the strange territory that lies between. When at last the lamps of London blinked into view, Holmes stirred, adjusted his cuffs, and said, "We will speak of it, Watson." But not as lawmen. As men back at Baker Street, amid the familiar clutter of monographs, test tubes, and tobacco ash, Holmes resumed his usual posture in the armchair by the hearth. He accepted the tea I poured but did not drink. Instead, he took the tongs and prodded the fire, as if its embers might speak more plainly than we. "You will wish to understand," he began at last, "the path by which a name becomes a mask." I leaned forward, notebook in hand, though I did not write. "Reuben Blythe," Holmes continued, "was a man of extraordinary skill and limited scruple. His early promise in the surgical theatre was undone by an experiment, rushed, unauthorized, but not without merit. A patient died. The coroner equivocated. The press delighted. The judge, Sir Rowland Ferrers, made an example of him. He tapped the fire once. Years later, in a northern sanatorium, Blythe met Adrian Melrose, young, consumptive, and already fading. The man died unrecorded. Blythe seized the chance, assumed his name, forged the necessary licenses, and rebuilt a life. I frowned, and no one noticed. Melrose had no family. Blythe kept to cities where he was not known, altered his methods, cultivated humility. He was not hiding in shame, Watson. He was hiding from silence, from the void left when one's name becomes a curse. I nodded slowly. And Rebecca? Holmes's gaze fixed on the coals. She found him too late, but she believed his ruin undeserved, and thus the daughter became the sword. Rebecca, Holmes said softly, believed in her father with the desperate fidelity of a child who had never ceased mourning. He set down his cup untouched and crossed his legs. She found him not through records, but fragments, medical whispers, chance sightings, anonymous letters never signed but written in a hand she knew. She approached under a false name, not to deceive him, but to protect the illusion she herself needed to survive. I felt the stir of something like pity. He knew, Holmes continued, from the first moment. He recognized her voice, the curve of her script, but he said nothing. That silence was not born of cowardice, Watson, but of fear. Fear that if he rejected her, she would be lost, and if he embraced her, the truth would ruin them both. I stirred in my chair. Then he let her believe. He let her believe, Holmes affirmed, and that belief calcified into justice, into anger, and finally, into action. Holmes stood then, briefly pacing. He never once asked her to kill, but he never forbade it either, and therein lies the gravest sin, not in the act itself, but in the cowardice of omission. A silence fell between us once more, and I could not argue with it. Was it murder? I asked quietly, or something else? Holmes considered my words for a long moment. It was both less and more than murder, he said. Rebecca Blythe did not plan it as an assassin might. She did not stalk or threaten, but nor was it chance. He returned to his chair. It was, in its most dreadful form, a gesture, a child offering proof of her love, measured not in forgiveness, but in vengeance. I stared into the fire, the flames too bright against the shadows that clung to my thoughts. She believed that Ferrers had destroyed her father, Holmes said. and that in returning that judgment she would restore some part of him. But what she restored, Watson, was not a man, but a memory that could not survive the light. I pressed my fingers together, and Reuben. Holmes's voice turned grim. He allowed her to do it, not by intention, but by surrender. He believed perhaps that the world had already passed judgment, and so the sentence no longer mattered. I felt the weight of it then, not merely the tragedy of action, but the erosion that came before it. In the end, Holmes said, it was not the poison that killed Sir Roland Ferrers. It was a story, buried, festering, and passed from father to daughter like a secret heirloom. The fire had burned low by the time Holmes rose to retire, but I remained where I was, unable to release the iron grip of thought. I had seen many criminals brought to justice, some cruel, some desperate, others merely foolish. But Rebecca Blythe had not been any of these. She had been, above all else, devoted. Devoted to a man who wore a borrowed name. Devoted to an idea of honour which had, in truth, never been whole. And I, who have always tried to hold fast to the line between sympathy and absolution, found myself faltering. She had committed murder. Of that there was no question. And yet, in her grief and in her silence, she had spoken a language all too human. Holmes had judged her with precision, not cruelty. But I saw in his stillness a sorrow that mirrored my own. Is guilt defined by the act or the intention? Does truth redeem us, or simply sharpen the blade of our condemnation? I left the parlour at last and ascended the stairs. But long into the night, I could not shake the echo of her voice nor the quiet dignity of her crime. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether justice and mercy always stood on opposite sides of the law. That night, the city wept. The storm arrived in relentless sheets, wind driving rain against the tall panes of Baker Street, with such fury that the gas lamps beyond danced like spectral sentinels in the dark. Thunder rolled far above, and each low rumble seemed to echo the unspoken gravity that had hung between Holmes and myself since our return. We sat as we often had, he in his armchair with fingers steepled, and I opposite him with a journal balanced across my knee, though the pen remained unmoving in my fingers. The hearth glowed between us, its warmth comforting, yet unable to dispel the moral chill the case had left behind. Neither of us spoke for some time. There was no need. The silence was not absence, but presence. The presence of understanding deeper than language, and sorrow more articulate than lamentation. Holmes stirred only once to refill his pipe. I watched the slow tendrils of smoke curl upwards like questions too heavy for the air to carry. Outside, the rain continued. At length, he said, almost to himself, "There are moments, Watson, when justice becomes a reflection too warped to recognize." I looked up, startled by the melancholy in his tone. But he said no more. In that room of flickering firelight and storm-swept windows, we remained. Two men bound not merely by companionship, but by the knowledge that the world did not always arrange its truths cleanly, nor distribute its tragedies with fairness. And though neither of us spoke it aloud, I knew we were thinking the same thing, that not all storms make themselves known in the sky. "I have long maintained," Holmes said, "that truth is the purest instrument of deduction. But pure instruments, Watson, may become weapons in hands untrained, or worse, in hands desperate." He spoke, without raising his eyes from the fire. It is a pleasant myth that truth is virtuous by nature. But truth is neither kind nor cruel. It is sharp. It cuts. And in the wrong moment, or in the presence of unhealed wounds, it may wound far more deeply than the lie it replaces. I set my journal aside, drawn by the rare earnestness in his voice. "In this case," he continued, "the truth did not liberate Rebecca Blythe. It shackled her. She did not know the full measure of her father's failings, only the outline of his pain. That half-truth, Watson, became a torch in her hands, and she carried it into darkness without understanding the shadows it cast. He tapped the edge of the mantle with his pipe. Would a lie have served her better? Number but truth, administered too late or too coldly, is not a cure. It is a diagnosis, and she was already terminal in her belief. His tone softened then. That is the cruel symmetry of it all. She murdered in the name of a truth that was never hers to wield. I sat back, struck by the gravity of the thought. Truth, I realized then, is no talisman. It is a blade, and whether it heals or harms depends not only on its bearer, but on the wound it seeks to expose. Holmes turned toward me with a strange mixture of weariness and clarity. There is, Watson, a peculiar arrogance that afflicts the bearers of titles, he said. Not merely the titled lords or baronets, but the subtler hierarchies, the doctor's white coat, the judge's robe, the fiancé's promise. He stood and began to pace slowly, as if walking out the pattern of his thoughts. These roles grant authority not because of virtue, but because of presumption. The world presumes the doctor seeks to heal, the judge to be fair, the lover to be loyal. But when the man behind the title is broken by grief, guilt, or vanity, that presumption becomes a cloak, and beneath it, rot may fester unchecked. He paused beside the window, watching the rain snake down the glass. Reuben Blythe wore a doctor's name, but no longer believed in healing. The judge bore the title of justice, but issued sentences that blighted lives beyond the courtroom. Even Rebecca, in calling herself Clara Farrow, hid behind an identity that begged trust. He looked back at me, eyes flinty with conviction. It is not wickedness that most often undermines the institutions of man. It is frailty, broken souls wearing unbroken titles, and in their silence, more harm is done than any loud villain ever achieves. He returned to the hearth, silent for a beat. I do not fear the criminal, Watson. I fear the wounded, when they carry symbols of righteousness, unaware that they bleed through them. I did not reply, but I understood. Holmes sat once more, but not in ease. His fingers did not rest as they usually did, but instead moved in subtle, unconscious gestures, tapping, flexing, curling, like a man still sorting through a knot long after the rope has broken. I have succeeded, he said, in solving a murder, in unveiling a deception, in illuminating the how, the when, the who. Then he looked at me, not proudly, but plainly. But I failed, Watson, in the only way that matters. I failed to prevent it. The words landed like stone on the floor between us. It is one thing to unravel the thread after the tapestry has torn, he continued. It is quite another to see the fray beforehand, and I did not see it, or rather, he paused. I saw it, but mistook its pattern. I reached for words of comfort, but he raised a hand to still me. Do not mistake me. I do not excuse Rebecca Blythe's actions, nor do I condemn her as wholly monstrous. That is the burden of truth. It does not allow absolutes. It permits only understanding. He drew a long breath. Understanding that a daughter tried to rescue a father already lost, that a man rebuilt a life not from ambition, but from ruin. That silence was not innocence, but exhaustion. He exhaled slowly, as if some great internal weight had been measured and set down. Some crimes, Watson, begin not with a motive, but with a memory. And in that, I knew he had reached the heart of it. The hour had grown late, and the storm outside had relented into a steady drizzle that painted the windows with silver streaks. Holmes, having said all that needed saying, returned to his study, leaving me with my pen and the fire. I opened the casebook. Its pages bore records of theft, of fraud, of violence and vice. But this entry I knew would be different. It was not merely a case to be solved, but a tragedy to be borne. I began with Holmes's words. I always did when they rang with meaning beyond method. Some crimes, Watson, begin not with a motive, but with a memory. And then I wrote of Reuben Blythe, a man who shed his name like a skin, yet could not rid himself of the wounds beneath it. I wrote of Rebecca, who loved her father too much to see him clearly, and in her devotion became both witness and executioner. I wrote of Holmes, who solved the crime, but did not celebrate it, who stood not above them, but beside them, weary with understanding. And finally, I wrote of truth, not as a virtue or a weapon, but as a scalpel, precise, merciless, necessary. The fire burned low. I closed the book, and as the embers dimmed, I found myself whispering what Holmes himself had once said, under different circumstances, yet with equal weight. And so ends another chapter in which truth, like a scalpel, cut far deeper than expected. As we sat once more before the dimming fire of Baker Street, Holmes leaned back with his steepled fingers pressed to his lips, his gaze distant yet sharp. "Watson," he said, "it is a peculiar thing, how a man may escape the noose of law, but not the ligature of memory. Our murderer sought justice. What she achieved was symmetry, blood for blood, name for name." He paused, his voice low. "But vengeance wears many disguises, and the cruelest of them all is love." I said nothing. Some truths settle more heavily than others. What do you think was the true turning point of this case? Was it the stolen identity, the silent influence of a bitter father? Or was it the moment someone mistook revenge for redemption? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tangled tale of secrets and shadows, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And share this story with a fellow mystery lover. The next case awaits.